The music stopped. The cruel laughter died. For 4 years, Crestview Academy's elite made Amelia's life a living hell, simply because of her size, culminating in a vicious prom night prank that left her shattered on the dance floor. They called her a fat pig, while the whole school pointed and sneered. But the laughter choked in their throats when the heavy ballroom doors suddenly slammed shut, locking them all inside. From the shadows stepped Lorenzo Costa, a man who didn't play high school games. Amelia Hastings was practically invisible, except for the times they needed a target. At Crestview Academy, an ultra-exclusive private school in the heart of Chicago, wealth and beauty were the only currencies that mattered. Amelia had neither. She was there on a rigorous academic scholarship, a brilliant mind, trapped in a socially unforgiving environment. But her intellect wasn't what the students of Crestview saw when they looked at her. They saw her weight. Amelia was fat. It wasn't a word she shied away from in the quiet privacy of her own bedroom, but in the echoing marble-floored hallways of Crestview, it was wielded like a weapon. While the other girls existed in a delicate carbon copy world of size 2 uniforms and hollow cheekbones, Amelia took up space. She had soft, generous curves, thick thighs, and a round face framed by a halo of dark, curly hair. In a different world, she might have been celebrated for her classical, Rubenesque beauty. But at Crestview, she was the anomaly. The ringleader of her daily torment was Chloe Davenport, a girl whose family practically owned the city's real estate market. Chloe was sharp blonde and possessed a cruelty that bordered on the sociopathic. Her boyfriend Brad Miller, the star quarterback with a trust fund large enough to bury his abysmal GPA, was always ready with a loud, braying laugh whenever Chloe delivered a punchline. "Careful, Hastings." Brad would sneer intentionally, bumping his shoulder into hers so hard her books would scatter across the floor. "Don't want to cause an earthquake in the science wing." Amelia would simply lower her eyes, her cheeks burning with humiliation, and kneel to gather her things. She had learned early on that fighting back only fueled their fire. Silence was her armor. Invisibility was her goal. But outside of Crestview, Amelia had a secret life, one that kept her grounded. She lived in a modest apartment above a failing bakery in the Italian district, a place she helped her overworked mother run. The smell of rising dough, sweet vanilla, and powdered sugar was baked into her skin. It was here in the warm, flour-dusted kitchen that her life had inadvertently intersected with the city's dark underbelly. It happened 7 months before the prom. It was a freezing November night rain, lashing against the steamed-up windows of the bakery. Amelia had been up late, furiously kneading dough for the morning rush, when the back alley door violently crashed open. A man stumbled in, bringing the bitter cold with him. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that was currently ruined by the terrifying amount of blood blossoming across his abdomen. He collapsed against the steel prep table, a heavy black handgun clattering to the linoleum floor. Amelia had frozen her heart, hammering against her ribs. She should have screamed. She should have run to the rotary phone on the wall and dialed 911. But when the man lifted his head, his dark, dangerous eyes met hers. He didn't look like a common criminal. He looked like a fallen prince. "No cops!" He had rasped his voice, a low, gravelly baritone that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Please." It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. Amelia, driven by an instinctive, almost reckless empathy, had nodded. She kicked the gun under the table, locked the deadbolt on the alley door, and ran to get the first aid kit her mother kept for kitchen burns and cuts. For the next hour, in terrifying silence, Amelia cleaned the grazing bullet wound on his side. She was gentle, her soft hands working with surprising efficiency. The man didn't speak, but his intense gaze never left her face. He didn't look at her with pity or disgust, or the mocking superiority she was so used to. He looked at her as if she were a lifeline. "What is your name?" he finally asked, as she taped a thick gauze pad over his side. "Amelia," she whispered, keeping her eyes down. "You have a gentle touch, Amelia," he had said, pushing himself up to a sitting position. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick roll of $100 bills, tossing it onto the flour-dusted counter. "I don't want your money," she said quickly, stepping back. She felt uncomfortably aware of her size, in her oversized, flour-stained apron, suddenly wishing she could shrink away. The man paused. He studied her, truly looking at her in a way no one ever did. "Then what do you want?" "I want you to leave before my mother wakes up," she had replied honestly. A ghost of a smirk played on his lips. "I am Lorenzo," he said softly. "Lorenzo Costa. And I don't forget a kindness, especially one that saves my life." He disappeared into the rainy night, leaving Amelia with a wild, beating heart and a secret she dared not share. She later learned from the whispered gossip in her neighborhood who the Costa family was. They weren't just the local mafia. They were a massive, deeply entrenched syndicate that practically ran the port, the unions, and half the politicians in Chicago. Lorenzo Costa was the ruthless young heir who had recently taken control after his father's violent passing. He was a ghost, a myth, a monster. But to Amelia, he was just the man who had looked at her like she mattered. Months passed. The memory of Lorenzo Costa faded into a surreal dream as the crushing reality of senior year bore down on her. As the school year neared its end, the only thing anyone at Crestview could talk about was the senior prom. Amelia had no intention of going. The idea of placing herself in a room full of her tormentors, dressed up and vulnerable, sounded like a form of psychological torture. But her mother had insisted. "You are beautiful, Mia Cara," her mother had told her, holding up a garment bag. "You have worked harder than any of those spoiled brats. You deserve one magical night." Inside the bag was a dress her mother had spent months paying off. It was a custom-made, deep emerald green gown. It didn't try to hide her body under layers of shapeless tulle. Instead, it was tailored perfectly to her curves, with a sweetheart neckline that accentuated her chest and a flowing skirt that made her feel like royalty. When Amelia put it on for the very first time in her life, she looked in the mirror and didn't want to look away. She felt a dangerous, fragile spark of hope. Maybe just for one night they would let her be. Maybe they would see the dress, see the effort, and simply leave her alone. It was a naive thought, one she would soon pay dearly for. The Grand Plaza Hotel ballroom was a vision of excessive teenage opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over ice sculptures, and tables draped in imported silk. The room was alive with the sound of a live band, the clinking of punch glasses, and the heavy, intoxicating blend of expensive perfumes and colognes. When Amelia arrived, stepping out of the humble yellow cab her mother had paid for, she took a deep, shuddering breath. She smoothed down the emerald satin of her dress. Her hair was pinned up in an elegant cascading style, and she wore a subtle red lipstick that made her dark eyes pop. As she walked through the arched entrance of the ballroom, a sudden heavy silence rippled through the immediate vicinity. Heads turned. Amelia's grip on her small clutch whitened. She kept her chin up just as she had practiced in the mirror. For a brief, suspended moment, she saw surprise on the faces of her classmates. She looked stunning. The emerald green complemented her skin tone perfectly, and the cut of the dress transformed her from the invisible fat girl into someone undeniably striking. Across the room, Chloe Davenport stood in a slinky silver designer gown, a glass of punch in her hand. Amelia saw the exact moment Chloe's eyes locked onto her. The surprise on the blonde girl's face quickly curdled into a cold, venomous fury. In Chloe's world, there was a strict hierarchy, and Amelia Hastings looking beautiful was a direct violation of the natural order. Chloe leaned into Brad's ear, whispering something that made the large quarterback smirk and nod. Amelia tried to ignore them. She found a quiet table near the back, near the dessert buffet, and sat down. A few of the quieter, nerdier kids gave her tight, polite smiles, but mostly she was left alone. She watched the couples dance, feeling a profound sense of isolation, but also a quiet victory. She was here. She was wearing the dress. She was surviving. 2 hours into the evening, the principal tapped the microphone on the grand stage, the high-pitched feedback echoing through the ballroom. "All right, seniors, it is the moment you have all been waiting for," Principal Higgins announced, adjusting his glasses. "It is time to announce the Crestview Academy prom king and queen." A loud cheer erupted from the crowd. Everyone knew Chloe and Brad were guaranteed to win. It was practically a rigged tradition. "Our prom king, to no one's surprise, is Brad Miller." Brad jogged up to the stage, high-fiving his friends, a plastic crown being placed on his head. He took the microphone. "Thanks, guys," Brad said, his voice booming over the speakers. "But a king needs a queen. And I think we all know who really deserves to wear the crown tonight. The votes have been tallied, and there was a massive write-in campaign." Amelia felt a cold spike of dread in her stomach. Something was wrong. Chloe wasn't moving toward the stage. Instead, Chloe was standing by the soundboard at the edge of the stage, a cruel, triumphant smile plastered on her face. This year's prom queen. Brad continued, his voice dripping with faux sincerity, "is a girl who really throws her weight around at this school. Let's hear it for the biggest girl on campus. Amelia Hastings." The spotlight, violently and blindingly bright, swung across the room and slammed directly onto Amelia's table. Amelia froze. The breath was knocked out of her lungs, as if she had been physically struck. She couldn't see anything past the glaring white beam of light, but she could hear everything. Silence hung for a split second, and then the cruelty began. Above the stage, a large banner suddenly dropped. It wasn't the traditional "Congratulations" banner. Instead, painted in crude, massive, dripping red letters, it read, "Crestview's Fat Pig." But the visual wasn't enough for Chloe. Through the massive, state-of-the-art speakers of the ballroom, a sound file began to play. It was the loud, obnoxious sound of pigs squealing and grunting. The ballroom erupted. It didn't start with everyone, but laughter is contagious in a room full of insecure teenagers looking for a scapegoat. Brad was laughing into the microphone, the sound booming over the pig noises. Chloe was practically doubled over. Soon the entire room of 500 students was laughing, pointing, and pulling out their phones to record her. "Oink oink Hastings!" someone shouted from the dark. "Don't eat the crown, Amelia," another yelled. Amelia sat paralyzed in the emerald dress that had made her feel so beautiful just hours ago. Now it felt like a costume, a cruel joke she had played on herself. Her chest heaved as she gasped for air, a panic attack seizing her throat. Tears, hot and fast, blurred her vision, ruining her careful makeup. The sound of the pig squeals and the mocking laughter melded into a deafening roar in her ears. She had to get out. She stood up so fast her chair clattered backward onto the floor. The spotlight tracked her clumsily as she turned and ran. She pushed past the laughing bodies, her vision tunneling. She didn't care where she went. She just needed to escape the light, the noise, the sheer crushing humiliation. She felt like she was dying, her heart cracking open on the ballroom floor. She reached the grand double oak doors at the entrance of the ballroom, grabbing the brass handles, tears streaming down her face, desperate for the cool air of the hallway. She pulled. The doors didn't move. She pulled harder, a sob tearing from her throat. They were heavy, solid oak, but they shouldn't be immovable. She rattled the brass handles frantically. Clack, clack, clack. The distinct, heavy sound of deadbolts locking echoed from the other side of the wood. Amelia stopped her wet hands, slipping off the brass. The laughter in the room began to falter, slowly replaced by a murmur of confusion. Then the music and the pig squeals abruptly cut off. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. The main breaker for the ballroom lights was thrown. The room plunged into pitch darkness, save for the emergency exit signs casting a sickly red glow. Screams of genuine alarm erupted from the students. "What's going on?" Brad's voice echoed nervously from the stage. "Chloe, did you do this?" "No." Chloe's voice was high and panicked. Suddenly the massive double doors that Amelia had just been trying to open swung inward with explosive force, knocking Amelia back a few steps. The hallway behind the doors was brightly lit, and silhouetted in the entrance were a dozen men. They weren't high school security guards. They were large, broad-shouldered men in immaculate dark suits. They stepped into the ballroom with terrifying synchronized precision, forming a wall by the exit. And walking through the center of them, stepping over the threshold of the Crestview Senior Prom, was Lorenzo Costa. Lorenzo wore a midnight blue tuxedo that looked sharper than a straight razor. His dark hair was slicked back, and his face was a mask of cold, unyielding stone. In his right hand, he held a heavy steel walking cane, though he walked with no limp. He didn't look like a teenager crashing a prom. He looked like an apex predator stepping into a cage of terrified mice. One of his men reached over and flipped a secondary switch. The crystal chandeliers flickered back to life, but they were dimmed, casting long, menacing shadows across the grand ballroom. The 500 students of Crestview Academy had gone dead silent. The atmosphere had shifted from a cruel comedy to suffocating terror in a matter of seconds. The raw, violent energy radiating from the men at the door was palpable. This wasn't a prank anymore. Lorenzo's dark, calculating eyes swept the room. He took in the terrified faces of the elite teenagers, the dropped phones, the plastic crown on Brad's head, and finally the horrific banner hanging above the stage, Crestview's fat pig. A muscle feathered in Lorenzo's jaw. It was the only micro-expression of emotion he allowed himself, but to the men standing behind him, it was a signal of catastrophic violence. Lorenzo's gaze lowered and finally landed on Amelia. She was standing just a few feet away from him, trembling violently, her face streaked with tears and ruined mascara. She was hyperventilating, staring at the man whose life she had saved 7 months ago. Lorenzo didn't acknowledge the room. He walked slowly, deliberately toward Amelia. The heavy thud of his steel cane against the marble floor echoed like a death knell in the silent room. When he reached her, the coldness in his eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a profound, startling softness. He stopped mere inches from her. "Amelia," he murmured, his deep voice carrying easily in the silent room. "Lorenzo." She choked out a fresh wave of tears, spilling over her cheeks. She was so overwhelmed by the humiliation, the shock and his sudden appearance that her knees buckled. Lorenzo dropped his cane. It clattered loudly on the floor. In a flash of movement, he reached out and caught her, his strong arms wrapping around her waist, holding her steady. He didn't care about her size. He held her as if she weighed nothing at all, pulling her gently against his chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair, his voice fierce and protective. "I am so sorry I was late. I should have been here." He stepped back slightly, and shrugged off his custom-tailored suit jacket. With immense care, he draped it over her bare shoulders, shielding her from the hundreds of staring eyes. The jacket smelled of expensive cedar and danger. "You look breathtaking," he told her, his eyes locking onto hers, demanding she believe him. "Like a queen." Amelia sobbed, pulling the lapels of his jacket tightly around herself. Lorenzo turned his head, his gaze sweeping back toward his men at the door. He nodded once to a tall, heavily scarred man holding a thick metal chain. The man stepped back out into the hallway, grabbed the brass handles of the double doors, and pulled them shut. A moment later, the terrifying sound of a heavy chain being wrapped around the handles from the outside echoed through the room, followed by the definitive click of a heavy-duty padlock. They were locked in. Completely. Panic began to bubble up in the crowd. A few boys near the back started looking toward the fire exits, but Lorenzo's men had already anticipated this. 4 men in suits smoothly detached from the group and blocked the emergency doors, their hands resting casually inside their jackets near their holsters. Lorenzo picked up his cane. He slowly turned to face the room. The softness he had shown Amelia was gone, completely eradicated, leaving behind a terrifying, hollow abyss in his eyes. "No one," Lorenzo said, his voice quiet, but echoing with dangerous authority, "is leaving." He began to walk down the center aisle of the ballroom toward the stage. The students parted for him, like the Red Sea, pressing themselves against tables and each other in their desperation to get out of his path. "My name is Lorenzo Costa," he announced. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Even these privileged teenagers knew that name. Fathers who worked in real estate law and politics whispered that name in fear. "And I have a strict policy about debts. When someone does me a great service, I repay them. When someone insults what is mine, I destroy them." He reached the edge of the stage. He looked up at Brad, who was currently trembling so hard the plastic crown was shaking on his head. "You," Lorenzo pointed the tip of his steel cane at Brad. "Come down here." I, Brad stammered, looking around for help. The jock bravado had entirely evaporated, leaving a terrified boy in a rented tuxedo. "It was just a joke. It was just a prank. I did not ask for a punchline," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping an octave. "I told you to come down." Brad scrambled off the edge of the stage, nearly tripping over his own feet. He stood before Lorenzo, sweating profusely. "Who organized this?" Lorenzo asked, gesturing with his cane to the offensive banner hanging above them. Brad swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the soundboard. It was Chloe." "Chloe Davenport. It was her idea. I just read the card." Loyalty, it seemed, did not exist at Crestview when true fear was introduced. Lorenzo turned his head slowly, his dead eyes locking onto Chloe, who was shrinking back against the soundboard, her face as pale as a sheet. "Bring her," Lorenzo commanded softly. 2 of Lorenzo's men surged forward, cutting through the crowd. Chloe screamed as they grabbed her by the arms, dragging her in her silver dress to the front of the room, forcing her to stand next to Brad. "Please," Chloe sobbed, real tears ruining her flawless makeup. "My father is Richard Davenport. He can give you whatever you want. Please don't hurt me." "Richard Davenport owes my family $3 million in construction kickbacks." Lorenzo interrupted, his tone bored. "Your father is a worm." And it seems the apple did not fall far from the tree. Lorenzo stepped closer to the 2 bullies. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. His terrifying stillness was worse than any tantrum. "You look at a girl who has more kindness, more intelligence, and more worth in her little finger than the 2 of you possess in your entirely pathetic manufactured lives," Lorenzo said quietly, "and you see a target. You mock her weight. You humiliate her." He stepped up right into Brad's personal space. Brad squeezed his eyes shut, whimpering. "You think this makes you a king?" Lorenzo whispered, tapping the plastic crown off Brad's head with his cane. It hit the floor and rolled away. "Let me show you what real power looks like, because tonight the rules of this school are suspended. Tonight, Crestview Academy belongs to the Costa family, and we are going to teach you a lesson in respect." The silence in the Grand Plaza ballroom was absolute, save for the ragged, terrified breathing of the students. Lorenzo Costa did not need to raise his voice or brandish a weapon to command the room. The sheer gravitational pull of his authority was enough. He stood before Chloe Davenport and Brad Miller, two teenagers who had spent their entire lives shielded by wealth, watching as their invincible armor evaporated into thin air. "You," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, lethal hum, as he looked at the school's principal. Higgins was cowering behind the punch bowl, his face flushed with panic. "Principal Higgins, step forward." Higgins hesitated, his eyes darting toward the chained doors, but a sharp look from one of the suited men sent him scurrying to the front. He stood beside Chloe and Brad, wringing his hands. "Mr. Costa," Higgins stammered, sweat beading on his receding hairline. "This is a gross misunderstanding. We do not condone bullying at Crestview. This prank was—" "Save your breath, Higgins." Lorenzo cut him off, the coldness in his eyes paralyzing the older man. "Do not insult my intelligence. I know exactly how Crestview operates. My men have spent the last 3 hours reviewing your private digital correspondence." A collective gasp swept through the room. Chloe's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face morphing into an expression of sheer horror. Lorenzo snapped his fingers. From the back of the room, a man in a sharp grey suit stepped up to the audio-visual soundboard, the very station Chloe had used to orchestrate her cruel symphony. He plugged a sleek black flash drive into the system. The massive projector screen behind the stage, which had just moments ago been waiting to display photos of the prom king and queen, flashed blindingly white before settling on a digitized document. "Let us talk about the truth," Lorenzo announced, his voice carrying effortlessly. "Let us talk about what hides behind the designer labels and the trust funds. Chloe Davenport, you view yourself as the untouchable elite of Chicago, but your reality is a house of cards." He gestured to the screen with his cane. It was a scanned bank statement, highly confidential, bearing the letterhead of a prominent offshore holding company. "Your father, Richard, hasn't possessed real wealth in 3 years," Lorenzo stated, his tone devoid of pity. "He lost everything in a desperate bid to corner the commercial real estate market in Lincoln Park. To maintain your family's lavish lifestyle, he has been embezzling from the union pension funds. He drives a leased Bentley and buys you Cartier bracelets on lines of credit he can never repay. Tomorrow morning, the feds will receive this file. Your family is utterly, irredeemably bankrupt." Chloe's knees gave out. She collapsed onto the marble floor, a strangled sob escaping her throat. Her designer silver dress pooled around her as the reality of her destroyed life set in. The crowd, her supposed friends and loyal subjects, stared in stunned, morbid fascination. No one moved to help her. Lorenzo shifted his gaze to Brad. The star quarterback was trembling violently, his eyes wide with a primal fear. The image on the massive screen shifted. It was an email chain explicitly detailing a financial transaction between Brad's father and an admissions officer at an Ivy League university. "Brad Miller," Lorenzo said, tasting the name as if it were ash. "Crestview's golden boy. You mocked Amelia's intelligence today, yet you possess a grade-point average so dismal it borders on illiterate. You boast of an early acceptance to Princeton. This email proves your father wired $400,000 through a shell corporation to purchase your seat." Brad buried his face in his hands, weeping openly. The illusion of his merit, his entire identity, was stripped away in front of the 500 people he desperately wanted to impress. "And you, Principal Higgins," Lorenzo continued, the screen flashing to a direct message thread. "You were fully aware of this prank. Chloe Davenport texted you at 4 o'clock this afternoon, detailing her plan to humiliate Amelia Hastings. You allowed it because Richard Davenport promised to fund the new athletic center. You traded a young woman's dignity for a tax-deductible donation." Higgins fell to his knees, openly sobbing, begging for mercy. "Please, Mr. Costa, I have a family, my pension." "Your career in education is over." Lorenzo promised, his voice a quiet death sentence. "By dawn, every news outlet in the state will have these documents, but that is tomorrow." Lorenzo turned his back on the 3 weeping figures and walked slowly back to where Amelia stood. She was still shivering beneath the heavy warmth of his bespoke tuxedo jacket, her eyes wide as she processed the systemic dismantling of her tormentors. She had fantasized about justice, but this was absolute surgical annihilation. Lorenzo stopped in front of her. The terrifying predator vanished, and once again, the gentle, reverent man who had bled on her bakery floor returned. "Amelia," Lorenzo said softly. He reached out his thumb, gently wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. His touch was warm and startlingly tender. "They built a throne on a foundation of lies. You built your life on genuine strength. It is time they recognize their superior." He turned back to the room, his demeanor hardening instantly. "Get up!" Lorenzo barked at Chloe, Brad, and Higgins. The 3 of them scrambled to their feet, swaying and sniffling. "You will walk over here," Lorenzo commanded, pointing his steel cane at the floor directly in front of Amelia. "And you will apologize to this woman, on your knees, like the peasants you truly are." Brad was the first to break. He stumbled forward, throwing himself to his knees before Amelia. He didn't look at her face. He stared at the hem of her emerald gown. "I'm sorry," Brad blubbered, snot running down his chin. "I'm so sorry, Amelia. I'm a fraud. Please just let me go." Higgins followed, practically crawling, murmuring endless streams of pathetic apologies, his face red and swollen. Finally, Chloe stepped forward. She was shaking with rage and humiliation, her teeth chattering. She looked at Amelia, and for a fraction of a second, the old venomous pride flared in her eyes. But then, Lorenzo took a single step forward, the tip of his cane striking the marble with a sharp, echoing crack. Chloe shattered. She dropped to her knees, bowing her head so low it nearly touched Amelia's shoes. "I'm sorry," Chloe whispered, her voice completely broken. "I'm sorry, Amelia." Amelia stared down at the people who had made her life a waking nightmare for 4 years. She expected to feel a surge of triumphant joy, but instead she felt a profound, hollow exhaustion. They were pathetic. They were small. For the first time in her life, looking down at them, she realized they were never better than her. They were just louder. "Tell them to leave," Amelia said, her voice surprisingly steady though quiet. I don't want to look at them anymore." Lorenzo nodded. He gestured to his men. "Take the 3 of them to the kitchens. Lock them in the walk-in freezer until we depart. Let them cool off." As Chloe, Brad, and the principal were dragged screaming and pleading from the ballroom, a new, different kind of silence fell over the remaining students. The apex predators of Crestview had been removed. With the ringleaders gone, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted from active terror to a paralyzing, breathless anticipation. 497 teenagers stood frozen, waiting to see what the mob boss would do next. Lorenzo looked up at the crude red-painted banner that still hung above the stage, Crestview's fat pig. "Tear that down," Lorenzo ordered. "Burn it in the parking lot." Two of his enforcers immediately vaulted onto the stage, ripping the canvas from its moorings. It fell in a crumpled, ugly heap and was quickly carried out a side door. "You," Lorenzo pointed at the terrified band members huddled in the corner of the stage. "Play something. Something beautiful." Now, the jazz band scrambled for their instruments. The pianist's hands were shaking so badly he missed the first few keys. But soon, a slow, melodic, and achingly beautiful waltz filled the tense air of the ballroom. Lorenzo turned back to Amelia. She stood out like a brilliant jewel in the dim room, the emerald satin of her gown shimmering. The cruel spotlight was gone, replaced by the warm, forgiving glow of the chandeliers. He didn't speak. He simply offered her his hand. Amelia looked at his outstretched palm. It was large, calloused, bearing a faint scar across the knuckles, the hand of a man who dealt in violence. But it was also the hand that had gently cupped her face, the hand that had held her steady when her world was collapsing. She took a deep breath, the scent of his cedar cologne grounding her. She slipped her hand into his. Lorenzo stepped closer, closing the distance between them. He placed his other hand firmly but respectfully on her waist. He didn't try to span her waist or hide her curves. He held her firmly, anchoring her to him, celebrating the space she occupied. "Follow me," he murmured, his dark eyes locked onto hers. He guided her into the center of the massive, empty dance floor. The crowd of students had pressed themselves against the walls, creating a wide, empty circle for them. As they began to move, Amelia stumbled slightly, her mind still racing. But Lorenzo was a masterful lead. He moved with a liquid, predatory grace, guiding her steps with subtle, confident pressures of his hand against her back. "Look at me, Amelia," he whispered as he spun her gently. "Do not look at them. They are ghosts. You are the only thing in this room that is real." Amelia forced her eyes up, meeting his intense gaze. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but the panic attack had faded, replaced by a strange, intoxicating warmth. "Why did you do this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You didn't have to come here. You didn't have to ruin them." "I told you," Lorenzo replied, his voice a velvet rumble against the music. "I do not forget a kindness. You saved my life in that kitchen, Amelia. But more than that, you saw me. You didn't look at me with the fear or greed that everyone else does. You just saw a man bleeding, and you offered comfort." He pulled her a fraction of an inch closer, the heat of his body radiating through her dress. "When I found out what these parasites were planning to do to you tonight..." Lorenzo's jaw tightened, the dangerous edge returning to his voice for a fleeting second. "I wanted to burn this building to the ground with them inside, but I realized that would not serve you. You needed to see them for what they are, weak, and you needed them to see you for what you are." "And what am I?" Amelia whispered, a lump forming in her throat. She had been called so many things for so many years. She was braced for a compliment, but she wasn't prepared for his sincerity. "You are extraordinary," Lorenzo said, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. "You are intelligent, compassionate, and fiercely beautiful. You carry your body like a queen who has temporarily forgotten her crown. I simply came to remind you." Tears pricked Amelia's eyes again, but this time they were not tears of humiliation. They were tears of relief, of a deep, foundational validation that she had been starved of for her entire adolescence. She let out a shaky breath and leaned into him, letting him take her weight as they glided across the marble floor. The entire school watched in utter silence as the mafia boss waltzed with the girl they had spent 4 years destroying. They watched as he treated her with a reverence and devotion that none of them had ever experienced in their superficial relationships. The mockery was dead. The laughter was extinguished forever. In its place was an absolute, terrifying awe. As the song reached its sweeping crescendo, Lorenzo brought them to a graceful halt. He didn't let her go. He stood there holding her in the center of the room, his eyes solely focused on her. "The doors will be unlocked now," Lorenzo said, loud enough for the trembling students to hear. "You will all leave, in silence. If I ever hear that a single one of you has spoken a disrespectful word to Amelia Hastings again, I will not bother with bank statements or emails. I will simply come for you. Are we understood?" A frantic, terrified murmur of "yes, sir," and "understood" rippled through the crowd of teenagers. "Good," Lorenzo said. He turned his attention back to Amelia, the coldness instantly vanishing from his face. "Are you ready to go, Mia Bella?" Amelia looked around the room one last time. She saw the terrified faces of the elite, the empty stage, the shattered remnants of her high school tormentor's social empire. The nightmare was over. She looked back at Lorenzo Costa, the monster of Chicago, who had become her dark knight. "Yes," Amelia said, a genuine radiant smile breaking through her tears. "Take me home." The heavy iron chains rattling against the brass handles of the ballroom doors sounded like a prison gate opening, but for Amelia, it was the sound of absolute liberation. Lorenzo's enforcer hauled the heavy oak doors open, and the cold, silent hallway of Crestview Academy lay before them. Lorenzo kept his hand firmly on the small of Amelia's back, his thumb resting gently against the emerald satin of her gown. They walked out of the Grand Plaza Hotel without looking back. Behind them, the terrified whispers of Chicago's teenage elite finally broke the silence. But the sound was small, pathetic, and irrelevant. Stepping out into the crisp, cool air of the Chicago night, Amelia took her first real breath in hours. A fleet of black-armored Cadillac Escalades idled silently at the curb, their exhaust pluming in the chill. Lorenzo's men formed a seamless, protective perimeter on the sidewalk. It was a staggering display of power, yet as Lorenzo opened the heavy rear door of the lead SUV for her, Amelia felt an overwhelming sense of safety. She slid into the plush leather interior, the rich smell of the car mingling with Lorenzo's cedar cologne as he climbed in beside her. The door shut with a solid bank vault thud, sealing them off from the rest of the world. As the motorcade pulled away from the hotel, gliding smoothly onto Lakeshore Drive, the neon lights of Navy Pier reflected in the tinted windows. Amelia watched the city blur by her mind, struggling to process the seismic shift in her reality. "You're quiet," Lorenzo observed softly. He reached into a hidden compartment between the seats, retrieving a crystal decanter and pouring 2 small glasses of amber liquid. He handed her one. "Drink. It will settle your nerves." Amelia took a small sip of the bourbon. It burned a warm, fiery path down her throat, grounding her. I can't believe that actually happened," she whispered, looking down at her glass. "My whole life they told me I was nothing. They made me feel like I was taking up too much space. And you dismantled their entire world in 10 minutes. Lorenzo swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his dark eyes studying her illuminated profile in the passing streetlights. "Power in this city is an illusion for most, Amelia," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping into a serious, reflective cadence. "People like Richard Davenport, they play at being untouchable because they have money. But true power is rooted in consequence. My family learned that the hard way. My grandfather ran the Southside operations during the era of Tony Joe Batter Zaccardo, a man who actually ruled Chicago. He taught my father that respect isn't demanded with loud voices or cruel jokes. It is earned through blood loyalty and absolute retaliation against those who cross you. He leaned closer, the intensity in his gaze pinning her in place. What they did to you tonight wasn't just a prank. It was an assault on your dignity. They looked at your body, a body that is entirely beautiful, rich and real, and they weaponized their own insecurities against it. I didn't just lock those doors to punish them. I locked them so they would be forced to witness exactly who they were trying to destroy. Amelia swallowed hard, her heart pounding against her ribs. No one had ever spoken about her body this way. The men in her neighborhood, the boys at school, they either ignored her weight or used it as a punchline. But Lorenzo spoke of her softness, her curves as if they were classical art. "But you didn't have to," Amelia said, turning fully toward him. "You paid your debt, Lorenzo. You left money at the bakery months ago. We were even." Lorenzo set his glass down. He reached out his large, scarred hand, gently cupping her jaw. His thumb traced the soft curve of her cheek. "Amelia," he murmured, his voice thick with a sudden raw emotion. "The money was for the medical supplies. It wasn't for you. You saved my life, yes. But over the last 7 months, I have watched you." Amelia's breath hitched. "You watched me." "I had my men keep an eye on the bakery. I wanted to make sure the men who shot me hadn't tracked me there." Lorenzo confessed, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. "But then I found myself reading the reports just to know you were safe. I watched you carry flour sacks twice your size. I watched you study at the counter until 2 in the morning. I watched you endure the cruelty of those spoiled children with a quiet, unbroken grace. I didn't come to your prom to pay a debt, Mia Bella. I came because I could no longer stand by and let the world treat my queen like a peasant." The words hung in the quiet, luxurious cabin of the SUV. "My queen." Amelia leaned into his palm, a tear slipping free and dampening his fingers. "I'm just a baker's daughter, Lorenzo. I'm not a mafia queen. I don't fit into your world. I don't fit into any world. You fit perfectly in mine," he promised fiercely. He leaned in, closing the distance between them, and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. "You take up exactly the amount of space you are meant to, Amelia. And I will burn down anyone who tells you otherwise." The motorcade turned off the main avenues, navigating the narrow, familiar streets of the Italian district. The bakery was dark, save for the single yellow bulb burning over the alley door. When the SUV rolled to a stop, Lorenzo didn't just let her out. He walked her to the door, his enforcers standing watch in the shadows. "Get some sleep," Lorenzo told her softly, waiting as she unlocked the deadbolt. "Tomorrow everything changes." Lorenzo Costa was not a man who made empty promises. When Monday morning arrived, Amelia walked into the grand foyer of Crestview Academy, bracing herself for the usual barrage of whispers and shoves. Instead, she was met with a terrifying, absolute silence. As she walked down the hallway, students literally pressed their backs against the lockers to give her a wide berth. Eyes hit the floor as she passed. There were no sneers. There were no jokes. Chloe Davenport was not there. Rumors were already spreading like wildfire that federal agents had raided the Davenport estate at dawn, seizing assets and freezing accounts, just as Lorenzo had promised. Brad Miller was absent as well. His Ivy League acceptance had been publicly revoked over the weekend, his father's illegal wire transfers making the front page of the Chicago Tribune. Principal Higgins had officially resigned for health reasons, effective immediately. Amelia walked to her locker, her heavy thighs brushing against each other, her soft stomach pressing against her uniform skirt. She didn't try to suck it in. She didn't hunch her shoulders to appear smaller. For the first time in 4 years, she held her head high, claiming her space in the hallway. 2 weeks later, on graduation day, Amelia stood on the stage as valedictorian. She wore her crimson robes proudly. When she looked out into the audience, past the sea of wealthy parents and terrified students, she saw him. Lorenzo Costa sat in the very front row, flanked by his men. He wore a sharp black suit, his dark eyes locked onto her with unwavering pride. When she finished her speech, a speech about resilience, true character, and refusing to be defined by the small minds of others, he was the first one to stand. His slow, deliberate applause echoed in the auditorium, prompting the rest of the terrified audience to immediately jump to their feet in a standing ovation. The real transformation, however, happened outside the walls of the school. Lorenzo began courting Amelia, properly stepping out of the shadows and pulling her into his glittering, dangerous world. Their first official date was at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse on Rush Street, a legendary Chicago establishment where power brokers, politicians, and mob bosses dined. Amelia wore a stunning, deep crimson dress that hugged her wide hips and accentuated her heavy, beautiful chest. When she walked into the restaurant on Lorenzo's arm, she noticed the other women, mob wives and socialites, staring. They were all razor-thin, surgically enhanced, and dripping in diamonds. Amelia felt a momentary spike of the old insecurity. She squeezed Lorenzo's arm. Sensing her hesitation, Lorenzo stopped right in the middle of the crowded dining room. He turned to her, entirely ignoring the heavy hitters of Chicago's underworld, who were watching their young boss with bated breath. "Do you see them?" Lorenzo asked quietly, his eyes sweeping over the room before locking intensely onto hers. "I see them staring," Amelia whispered. "They are staring because they have never seen a real woman walk through these doors." Lorenzo said, his voice loud enough to carry to the nearest tables. "They are looking at a woman who survived their cruelty, a woman who possesses a mind sharp enough to run this city, and a heart strong enough to save my life. You are the most magnificent creature in this room, Amelia. Let them look. Let them envy." He kissed her right then and there. It wasn't a gentle peck. It was a deep, possessive, claiming kiss that left Amelia breathless and sent a clear, undeniable message to the entire Chicago syndicate. This woman is mine, and she is your queen. As the months passed, Amelia didn't shrink herself to fit into the mafia world, nor did she let it corrupt her. She went to college on her hard-earned scholarship, studying business and law. She took over the finances of her mother's bakery, turning it into a thriving, protected enterprise. And by her side always was Lorenzo. He was a ruthless monster to his enemies, a terrifying force of nature in the underworld. But in the quiet moments in his penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline, he worshipped the ground she walked on. He kissed her soft stomach. He buried his face in her thick thighs, and he loved every single ounce of the woman who had saved him. They had called her a fat pig. They had tried to lock her in a cage of humiliation. But they had forgotten one crucial rule of the world: you never corner a survivor, especially not one who holds the leash of the city's most dangerous predator. Amelia Hastings didn't just survive the cruelty of the elite. She outweighed them, she outsmarted them, and ultimately she ruled them. Amelia's story proves that true power isn't about shrinking yourself to fit someone else's mold. It's about taking up the space you deserve and watching the world bow to your strength. Lorenzo saw the Queen hiding beneath the cruelty of Crestview, and together they redefined what it means to rule. If you loved this story of vengeance, loyalty, and fierce mafia romance, hit that like button right now Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a dramatic comeback and subscribe to our channel for more intense, real-life romantic thrillers. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were locked in that ballroom? See you in the next video.